All right. With the help of Hashem, we are learning Sukah Daf Mem Hey. We're going to be starting with the new Mishnah, 4 lines from the top of the Amid. The Mishnah is going to set forth the procedure that was followed in the Beis HaMikdash's Arava ceremony. We're going to also learn the key to the secret of the Shem Ab. It's going to be the Rashi on Sukah Daf Mem Hey. We're going to have in the Gemara a description of the Arava branches. We're going to speak out clearly the Shita of the Rambam that interprets the word chibut when it comes to the Arava as we normally interpret the word chibut, which is banging, or in Yiddish clapping the Hoishanas, unlike Shitas Rashi that we spoke out continuously that interprets the word chibut as waving. There are actual some communities when it comes to Hoshana Rabbah, they both wave and they bang. Our minig is only to bang the Aravas. We're going to have some Agadata on this daf. The Gemara is going to tell us that Kol Hanoit Lulav Bi Igudoi, which is you're going beyond the letter of the law, because we don't paskin like Rebbe Yehuda. We don't demand for Lulav to be bound into a bundle. So if someone goes beyond that and they do bind the Lulav as we do, you make sure that the hadas is properly plated, even though we really paskin like Rabbi Tarfon, that holds that even if the top of the hadas is severed, it's okay. But when we make sure that it should be beautiful, so then it's as if ki'ilu banam is be'ach, the hikruv olive carbon, and from there we're going to go into various agadic interpretations on the pasuk Isru Chag ba'avosim ad karnois hamizbeach. We'll teach that pasuk kipshutai, and then we're going to have various drashas, how to also understand that verse. On Daf Mem Hey Amid Beis, we have the statement of Rab Shimon Bar Yochai regarding Re'isi b'nei Aliyah v'hemuatim. But no matter how few b'nei Aliyah, which is a very high level of a tzaddik, there are, him and his son were always part of them. And we're going to begin the sugya of whether and when do we have to make the brachos before taking the lulav, before dwelling in the sukkah, whether it's only done on the first day, whether it's done on all 7 days. We're going to have really in the Gemara 3 different opinions. I know that nowadays we do it every day prior to taking to the lulav. We do it every time prior to dwelling in the sukkah. But as we will see, the 2 dominant opinions that we will have in the Gemara, that either lulav, the bracha is made 7 days, and sukkah only on the first day, or the opposite. And Chevra, a lot more. Again, let us start on Daf Mem Hey, Amid Aleph, beginning of the line, 4 lines from the top of the Amid, starting with the new Mishnah. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam she'ar kol haim v'dvarim. Says the Mishnah, mitzvahs Arava Ketzad. We're focusing on the mitzvah of the Arava in the Beis HaMikdash. Says the Mishnah, Makim Hoylamatam Yerushalayim. There was a place that was geographically down low in Yerushalayim. Down low meaning it was a place where when it rained, the waters gathered there, which is all going to be the Milsa al Gav Urcha Kamash Malan. Why is it that those Aravas were very tall, as we'll see soon? And Vinikra Moitza, that place was called Moitza. The Gemara will explain Moitza means outside of. Now, it wasn't outside of, it was a tax-free zone. It was a place that was outside of taxes. Why was it a tax-free zone? Because everything that was there, the few things that grew there had very little value, and therefore it was automatically ownerless, and there weren't taxes on ownerless items. And that was another milsa agav urcha kamashmalan. We took the Aravis in the Beis HaMikdash from a place where it wasn't shaykh for it to be stolen, because it came from an ownerless place. And Yardim L'Sham, so the Beis Din or the Beis HaMikdash send representatives to go down to that place. Again, it's Hefker. Umelaktin Misham, and they would gather from there Murbiyos Shal Arava, branches of Arava, branches of willows, and Ubayim V'Zoik V'N Oisam Mitzidei HaMizbeach. And then they would come. The they is here. The they is probably already Kohanim. The Kohanim would then stand them up and lean them on the sides adjacent to the Mizbeach, all around the Mizbeach, How tall were these aravos that the tips or the tops of these aravos were kefufim, they were bent over al gabi hamizbeach. They were bent over the mizbeach. Very meduyak. Bent over the mizbeach means that not only was the arava going higher than the altar, but they would, at the end, they would bend down. And even when they bent down, the tips never actually were flush or brushed on the mizbeach. They remained over the mizbeach, and from that, the Gemara is going to extrapolate exactly how tall were these aravas. Now, we already had above a machlokes, amoraim. Evidently, from our Mishnah, you can learn both ways, whether they would actually walk around and lean it, or whether they would only lean the aravas, and when the kohanim would walk around, they would only hold the lulavim. That was the argument. But at some point, taku v'hariu v'taku. Taku v'hariu v'taku, tkiya, teruah, tkiya. We know already from Rosh Hashanah, there was a debate what teruah means. It either means shuvarim, or it means teruah, or it means, so we do both. And kimin hagenu. So tashrat, tashat, tarat. Very interestingly, Tosfos writes, the third Tosfos, that these types of blowings of trumpets, this is not the shofar, is connected to a blowing of joy, mishum simcha. I'm saying that in contrast to the 10 shitas, exactly why we blow the shofar on Rosh Hashanah, but this is not the shofar, these were trumpets, and they were soundings of joy. What's the joy? The joy of fulfilling the mitzvah of Arabah. And now the Mishnah continues, B'chol Yom, every single day, Makifin es ha-mizbeach v'amachas. The kohanim would walk around the mizbeach one time. Again, either holding the aravos, or the other shita was, they would just walk around it once with their lulavim. And while they were walking around, what would they say? Ba'omrim, Ana Hashem oishiana, Ana Hashem atzlichana. Rabbi Yehuda, Omer, what would they say when they walked around the mizbeach? Ani vohu hoishiana. Now, where do we have in the Chumash, in Tanach, apasik ani vohu hoishiana? Let's take a quick break. And this is a very important Rashi. So how do we know how to put together Shem Ab? Let me just explain like this, that you have various holy names of Hashem. And sometimes when we speak about Shem Ab and Shem Ban and Shem Ma and Shem Sag, we are referring to taking the Yud Kei Vav Kei, spelling it out in its entirety. So Yud is not just a Yud, it's Yud. It can be spelled Yud Dalid, which would give just the letter Yud the numerical value of 14. You can spell it Yud Vav Dalid. Yud Vav Dalid is 20. And similarly, the other letters of God can be spelled out in different ways. Hey can be spelled Hey Aleph. Hey can be Hey Hey. Hey can be spelled Hey Hey Yud. And then if you sum up the total number of the entirety of the God's holy name, it'll have a different numerical value. That's one way of understanding Pashat the Taich of Shem Ban, Shem Sag, etc. However, there's another understanding of these Shemos, and that is that you take various letters of the Aleph base, and they are always put together in triplets, and you have to know which letters to put together, and they form these holy names. Many times when we speak about Shemos HaKadoshim, we're speaking about such triplets. Similarly, when it comes to the Shem Ab, in other words, there's a name known as the holiest name of God, the 72-letter name, which has to do with taking 72 letters, but they're not just written one letter after the other. They're joined together in triplets, in groups of 3. Now, the Shem Ab, 2 of the names of Shem Ab is Ani, Aleph Nun Yud, and another one is Vav Hey Vav. Actually, in the Shem Ab, the Vav Hey Vav comes way before the Shem of Aleph Nun Yud. How do we put these letters together? How would we know what these letters are? So let's read inside Rashi 3 lines from the top of the Amud. Ani Vahu. So first of all, Ani Vahu, Rashi says, is Bigematria Ana Hashem. Well, why didn't you just say Ana Hashem? So says Rashi Va'oid, that Ani Vahu is Mishivim Vishtayim Shemoisem. They are from Shem Ab, Hamekuvim b'shalish mikrais hasemuchen b'parshas Vayihi b'shalach. That you open up a chumash in what we call the Sedra of Vayihi b'shalach paroi, which is Shmois, Perek, Yud, Dalid. And if you look at the 3 verses at the three psukim, pasuk Yutes, pasuk Chaf, and pasuk Chaf Aleph. Pasuk Yutes begins with the words Vayisa v'goymer. Pasuk Chaf begins with the words Vayave be'machna. Pasuk Chaf Aleph begins with the words Vayet Moshe es Yadoi. All together, Ushloshtan b'nei shivim u'shtayim oisiyas. Count the letters. There's a total of 72 letters in these three verses. Umehen shem hamafurish. And if you know how to configure them correctly, that is what the shem hamafurish is. God's explicit name. And Rashi tells us the soid. And how do you put them together? You take the first letter of the first pasuk. So the first pasuk, which is pasuk Yutes, is Vayisa. The first letter is Vav. Then you take the last letter of the middle verse, the last letter of pasuk Chaf. The last letter is letter Hey. We're just showing how we get to Vahu, Vav, Hey, Vav. Where did that come from? And then you take the first letter of the last of these three, the first letter of pasuk Chaf Aleph. That's the way you configure the Shem HaMafurish. So you take the first letter of the first verse, the last of the middle, and the first of the third. Then you take the second letter of the first pasuk. Again, the first pasuk is pasuk Yutes. You take the second to last letter of the middle. You take the second to last letter of pasuk Chaf, and you take the second letter of pasuk Chaf Aleph. And that's the way you configure or you reconfigure all of these three verses. Hashem Harishain, the first triplet, which is what we're calling the Shem, the holy name, will be Vav Hey Vav. And Rashi says it's the Vav from Vayisa, it's the Hey from the last word in the middle verse, which is Halaylah, ending with a Hey, and then the first letter of the third pasuk, which is the Vav of the word Vayet. That's the first of these configurations. Vav Hey Vav. V'Shem Hashloishim V'Sheva. We're not going to the 72nd, but we're going to now to 70 to 37, which is the Shem 37 is Aleph Nun Yud Ani. And he tells you where this letter comes from. The Aleph comes from the words Achareim. The Nun, right, is from the pasuk, from the word Rishon. And I'm sorry, the Nun Harishoin, the first Nun of the letter Ha'onan, because Onan has two Nuns. Becheshbon shel mafrei, when you're going backwards in the middle verse, and the yud, right, of the third of pasuk Chaf Aleph, which yud from Kadim, from Ruach Kadim. So they mentioned two names of Shem Ab, and now we're coming back. Now, why dafka those two? I'm sure there are reasons that are beyond our knowledge, but they also are begematria Ana Hashem. So you did the best of both worlds. You know, the Tanach says you say Ana Hashem, so they alluded to Ana Hashem by also evoking two of the Shemes HaKadoshim of Shem Ab back inside the Mishnah. And on that day, meaning on the seventh day of Sukkot, the day that we call Hoshana Rabbah, they would circle the altar, not one time, but 7 times. Now, people think that we also do it the same. We don't. Even though, yes, other than Shabbos, we circle the Mizbeach, we circle we circle the Bima once on all the other days of Sukkot, other than Shabbos, and 7 times on Hoshana Rabbah, but we do not do it. We don't do the ceremony of Chibut Aravas. The Chibut Aravas is what we do only once, as we learned above, that since outside the Beis HaMikdash, not a single day is a D'oraisa, so when we make a Zeicher LaMikdash, 1 day is enough. Okay, weiter in the Mishnah. Pshas Petirasam, after the ceremony, Mahei Moimrim, we're speaking about after the final ceremony, L'chur on the 7th day, then they would make the following statement, and they would say, Yoifi L'cha Mizbeach, right, to you is this beauty, O altar. In other words, they're speaking about the greatness of the altar. Unlike a woman, as we'll learn later, who spoke very negatively about the Mizbeach. And we repeat that twice. Yoifi L'cha Mizbeach. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, not only did we speak about the beauty of the altar, but we also said words of praise to God Almighty. Liyutke Ulacha Mizbeach. And again, that was repeated twice. Leka Shem Yutke Ulacha Mizbeach. Furthermore, says the Mishnah, Kamaseo B'choil, Kach Maseo B'Shabbos. This is dafka about the 7th day, that even though normally during the other 6 days, beginning with the first day to the sixth day. If that day would fall on Shabbos, they would not do the Arava ceremony. On the seventh day, it would override Shabbos. In other words, we would not go into this Gezerah de Rabbah, and we would do in the Beis Hamikdash the Arava ceremony. The only difference would be is that we would not gather it on the day itself, because you're not allowed to do koitzer on Shabbos. Elo, shehoyu melaktim oisam erev, they would gather the Aravos erev Shabbos, umanichen oisan, and they would leave them bigigiyoi shalzav in golden barrels and golden containers. And why? Kadei shelo yichmoshu, in order for the Aravos not to wilt, not to wither, for them to be as fresh as possible, even without picking them on Shabbos. That it wasn't willows, or it wasn't only willows. They would bring the palm branches. Now, Machlokes, whether Rabbi Yochanan ben Broika is saying that they would not bring willows, yes, only palm branches, or whether Rabbi Yochanan ben Broika holds that aside of bringing the Aravis, they would also bring palm branches. And now he says the words, and v'choiftin oisen bakarka, choiftin, Rashi, wave, Rambam, choiftin, beat, clapping, bang them on the ground. Now, waving on the ground is difficult, but azoi, when b'tzidi hamizbeach, on the side of the altar, and on that day, which is on the seventh day, they would call the day chibut chariyos, the day that we clap, that we bang. Let's go with the Rambam because that's our minhag. The way we bang these palm branches, we call it chibut hoishanas. And we again, we don't paskin like Rabbi Yochanan ben Broika, certainly not as a zecher. We only use, as we spoke out, we only use aravos. And even though we learned that the minimum is 3, our minhag is to use 5. We follow the Rambam that we bang it, and al pi Arizal, dafka banging it 5 times, not less, not more. And finally, the final statement in the Mishnah is that we're speaking about what happens on the 7th day. After they did the ceremony, in other words, they already had fulfilled the mitzvah of taking the dalad minim. So now, miyad tinoikoi shemtem es lulavim, the adults would grab the lulavim from the children, and va'oichlin esregeim, and they would eat their esregim. In other words, a couple of things. Number one, on the 7th day, it sounds like our Tanach holds that the items that we used for the dalad minim are from now on allowed to be used for mundane purposes. We'll learn about the sugya a bit later, because during the 7 days, we also had it above regarding can you smell it? There's a concept that once something is designated for a mitzvah, during that period, don't use it for anything else other than the mitzvah. Certainly, if its primary purpose, which is like the esrog, is to eat, don't eat it. The mitzvah now is over. So that's number one. Number two, the concept of snatching it from the hands of the children, like Rashi points out, is to tell you that since this was the norm, and everyone who bought the dalad minim knew that at the end of Yom Tov, people are just going to help each other from everyone else's, there isn't an issue of gezel, there isn't an issue of darkei shalom, and this minhag came about as one of the ways that people express their joy. Simchas poided together, joy breaks all boundaries. So there was like this type of fraternity, this type of sharing. Everyone just snatched the other person's dalad minim, and they had the esrog party. It's hard to understand how they ate it, but we already had above. I think it was Rabbi Hanina that he would eat it every day from the 2nd day onwards. They would put it into a sauce. It shouldn't be that bitter, but that was a way that they expressed their simcha connected to the mitzvah. Okay. Let's start with the Gemara. The Gemara is going to break down the Mishnah. The Gemara is going to focus on the area from where the Shluchei Beis Din or the Shluchei Beis Hamikdash would get every day of these 7 days, unless it was Shabbos, not on the 7th, the Aravos. So Tana, we learned that Makom Kolonia, a colony, Makom Kolonia Hava. Rashi says the word Kolonia, the original meaning of a colony, is a location that's tax-free or duty-free, a tax-exempt area. Now that's the place from where they got the Aravos. Why does our Tana call it Moitza? Moitze means out. Exactly, it's connected because either the Mepek, Mekarga, the Malka, since it was a location that anything that came from there was exempt from the king's taxes, so our Mishnah calls it Moitze. It was outside his dominium of taxes, and that's important, like we mentioned, being that the Mishnah, right, last Pedic, Lulav Hagazel, that you're doing a mitzvah, we don't want the mitzvah to come from theft, right? Even when you don't have the concept of lochem, but we do have an idea of mitzvah haba ba'avera, and the best way of guaranteeing that this item will not be stolen is that since this did grow in areas that was considered ownerless, get it from there. And it was of great quality. It wasn't that it was ownerless, but aravis to begin with, they don't have that much function. In other words, doesn't have a good smell, doesn't have a good taste. So the king did not charge any taxes from that. The government did not charge taxes. Right. They would lean it up against the Mizbeach. And as the Mishnah says, and kfufin al gabe, it would be bent over on top. Oh, so says the Gemara Tani, we learned in a Braisa. Number one, rabbis va'arukois. I want you to know that the Arabois were many. They got many Arabois, and they were very long. You know how long? That the Gavoyas, they were tall. Achad asarama, they were 11 amas tall. That's very tall. Why? Why did we need them to be that tall? For them to be leaning over the Mizbeach, an entire Amo. Leaning over, guys, doesn't only mean that it went above. Leaning over means that after it went above, it would lean down, it would bend down, and it would still be over the altar. Now, we'll say this by heart because we learned this together, and we'll learn this again, God willing, together, regarding the height of the Mizbeach. Even though the width and the length was substantially made larger than the one that Moshe Rabbeinu made, but we're going to follow the Tana that takes the pasuk out of its literal meaning, that even Moshe Rabbeinu's Mizbeach was 10 amas tall, even though it appears in the Chumash that the Torah writes explicitly otherwise, but we'll leave that for when we learn the Sugah of the Mizbeach. The Mizbeach that was built in the temple was certainly 10 amas tall, but it wasn't that the Mizbeach was 10 amas tall. The totality of the altar was 10 amas tall. The final amma on the top was the horns that were an amma, by an amma, by an amma. If you don't count the height of the horns, then from the ground until the top of the altar, there were 9 ammas. Another important detail, the Mizbeach, as you went higher up, would become a little bit smaller. Smaller meaning that on the ground, ultimately, we had a 32 by 32 ammas. Then it went up 1 amma, but then it went in 1 amma. And that is actually what created the base, the Yesod. So once you are above the base, it's 30 by 30. It went up another 5 ammas, which means from the ground 6 ammas. Then you had another indentation, a full amma in from all sides. And that was what we called the ledge. You have the Yesod, and the ledge is called the Soiviv. Then you had another 3 ammas. That's the 9 ammas. So the Gemara is going to make a cheshbon, we're just saying it out by heart, that when you put something on an incline, you lose a little bit of height. It has to travel more. So for the Arava to go over the Mizbeach, and for it to bend over, and it's bent an amma. For you to bend something an amma, it means it has to go an amma up and an amma down. For the bent part to be an amma. Even after it went an amma down, it wasn't brushing on or laying on the altar. It was always over the altar. That not only will demand for the height of the Arava to be 11 ammas, but it's actually going to be placed on top of the base. If you place the bottom on top of the base, you are already gaining a full amma. If you were to place that Arava on the ground, right, so it's 9 ammas up, really it's going to be, you're going to need a little bit more than 9 ammas because it's on an incline. And then it's going to go up an amma and down an amma, just that is 11. The loss of height, because it's traveling on an incline, that loss will bring it down for it to be brushing on the Mizbeach. It won't remain over the Mizbeach. It's too precise. But since they did not put it on the ground, but the bottom part of the Arava was put on the Yesod, so they already gained the full Amma, that affords us that it can go over the altar. It can go up an Amma over the Mizbeach, bend down an Amma, and still not touch the Mizbeach. And I will read that inside. So Amar Meremer, in the name of Marzutra, Shema Mina, that in order for it to still be Al HaMizbeach, over after bending down an Amma, still over, Aliyah, it was placed on the base and not on the ground, because the if they would have placed it on the ground, behold, let's go according to Mishnah and Midrash describing the height of the Mizbeach. Ola Amma, when you went up from the ground, the first Amma, then Vikanas Amma goes in an Amma, and that is the Yisoid. From there, Ola Chamesh, another 5 Vikanis Amma, that's the Soivit. Then on Ola Shalosh Zemakim Kiranois, from the ground until the top, excluding the horns, you have 9 Ammas. Now, Goichais Al Gabim Mizbeach, how can you say that they were leaning over a full Amma? Leaning, meaning the leaning part, the part down was a full Amma. So it went up and down an Amma. So that's 2 plus 9, that's 11. So it's exactly 11. The fact that it was put on an incline makes you lose a little bit of the 9. If that would have been the case, then it wouldn't have been over the Mizbeach, it would have been flush or a little bit already laying on the top of the Mizbeach. But Goichais al Gaba Mizbeach is not possible. And it must be Shema Mina, that you didn't put it on the ground, that you put it on the Yisoid. That means you only needed 8 Ammas for it to become equal, flush with the top of the altar. And now you lost a little bit by the incline, Sum Gesund. It still went up, it went over, and it went down the final Amma, and it wasn't yet touching the top. Shema Mina, that Manach, Elalav Shema Mina, that Ayisoid Manachlu, indeed, Shema Mina, because you only needed 8 Ammas and not 9, and that explains how it went over and it bent down an Amma and it still wasn't touching the Mizbeach. Now, Omar Rababo Maikra, could we find a remez in a pasuk regarding these Aravis being, now don't forget, if it went up and down, that means that if you want to look, if someone looked at the height of, you didn't see the tip because the tip was down, but the highest part of the Aravis were more or less at the height of the horns, because the horn was also up 1 amma. And the remes for that is Isru Chag Ba'avoisim Ad Karnois HaMizbeach. Now, Chevra, the literal, the pshat of this verse, Isru Chag Ba'avoisim, right, which is what we say in Hallel, means bind the festival. Now, what does the festival refer to? The pshat, it refers to the carbon, the korbanos that we bring with cords, binded ba'avoisim, with cords, up until the horns of the Mizbech. That's the pshat. Here he's teaching it that Isru is from circling. Which they put the aravas, they stood them around, leaned over. So we circle the altar when Chag on the Yom Tov of Sukkot, ba'avoisim, it's amazing, with aravos. And how tall did they go? It's not just circling it with our aravos that are beautiful, but they're relatively short, a couple of tvachim. The height was at Karnois HaMizbeach, mamish, because it went even over the top. It went up an amma and then down an amma, so it became like the horns of the Mizbeach. Now that we touched a drasha on this pasuk, Isru Chag Ba'avoisim Al Karnois HaMizbeach, now the Gemara is going to give us other agadic interpretations of this verse. Amar Rabbi Abo, in the name of Rabbi Elazar, Kol hanoit lulav bi'igudai, someone who takes a lulav with its binding. And like we mentioned, that we don't paskin like Rabbi Yehuda. Eged is not essential. Yes, it's done to beautify the lulav. In other words, we are doing something that is beyond the letter of the law. We're going above the call of duty. Similarly, if we make sure that our hadassim is ba'avoisai, is while they are beautifully plated, even though we paskin like Rab Tarfon that says that even if the top of the hadas is severed, it's still okay. So it would suffice to have an improperly plated hadas, but we make sure that our hadassim are beautifully plated, then it's tantamount, it's considered ki'ilu bana mizbeach, as if we built an altar and we offered anat on carbon, because we're going beyond the call of duty. Beyond the call of duty is called be made a sacrifice. Shenemar, as it says, daf mem hey yom days again, Isru Chag. Now here, what's the drasha? Isru can mean binding. Binding what? Binding the lulav. Ba'avoisim is a remes to the hadas, because avoisim can mean plated. And if we do both the igud, the isru, and the ba'avoisim, it's to God Almighty as if we brought a carbon to the mizbeach. At kan is a mizbeach. Beautiful. Amar Rabbi Yirmiyah, in the name of Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai. Likewise, Rabbi Yechanan said the following: Mishum Rabbi Shimon HaMachoisi, who said it in the name of the Tana Rabbi Yechanan HaMachoisi, not the Amoyed. The Amoyed Rabbi Yechanan. The Amoyed Rabbi Yechanan said it b'shem. That kol ha'oiser isur lachag ba'achila v'shasiya, the final agadic interpretation. Whoever joins the Yom Tov to eating and drinking. What are we talking about? Joining the Yom Tov to eating and drinking. Rashi gives two interpretations. Number one is whoever makes an extra effort to have fancy food for Yom Tov. Or Rashi says, whoever makes an effort to eat extra food on the day after Yom Tov, that is the common amongst the Yidden. We call the day after Yom Tov Isru Chag. Isru means the day that we are binding to the Yom Tov, or we are taking some joy of Yom Tov and we're bringing it into the day afterwards. Today, the Olam calls the day after Yom Tov Isru Chag. So you should know that that's so beautifully accepted by God Almighty. Mal all of our kosiv, the Torah, the verse considers it ki'ilu bana mizbeach, as if the person built an altar and vehikra olive carbon and offered a carbon in a good way. Shenemer, as it says, Isru Chag ba'avoisim ad kanes hamizbeach. So Isru Chag means to join the Yom Tov. The avoisim comes from the word av. Av means something that's fat. It's referring to fattened animals, which are the types of karbanos, right? Not like Kevan's little skinny deer picture over there, that in the Mizbeach we would bring as a gesunte karbanos. So if we eat special food on the day afterwards, it's as if we brought a fat carbon and we brought it all the way to the corners of the Mizbeach. Okay, so just to understand the flow, so we are quoting the first opinion is the top of the Amid, that this was said in the name of Rabbi Yirmiyah, in the name of Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai. So now let's continue. Amar Chizkiya, in the name of Rabbi Yirmiyah, Mishum derashbi, that kol hamitzvahs kulam, ein adam yoytze bahem elo dalach gidilasan, that we have various mitzvahs that demand of us to take something of nature. Oh, I don't need that. I need that background given by you, not over here a picture. The obligations of leaving things erect. Now, what needs to be erected? So, guys, there are two mitzvahs. Number one, the dalad minim. We hold them upright, and there is the way they grow in nature. And then if we wanted to, now that they're cut off, we could have taken them in the opposite direction. Similarly, when we built the Mishkan, we needed to build the main beams, which made the walls from atzei shitim. There's the way they are in the tree. And if we wanted to, we could have flipped them upside down. So it said in the name of the Rashbi that they are only good if you erect them the way they grow, in the manner in which they grow. And where do we get that from? From the Mishkan. That when it says by the Mishkan, atzei shitim oimdim, the pasuk says v'asisa es hakarashim, atzei shitim oimdim, and our Chevra, the Torah could have written, make the beams, make the karashim, oimdim, atzei shitim, standing from atzei shitim. That would have been good. The fact that the word oimdim is not before atzei, but it's after atzei, that comes to tell you that even when you put atzei shitim, they have to be standing the way they stand in nature. And similarly, when we take the lulav and the hadas and the arava, they have to be kederach gedilasan, which is why we learned above the Tosfos that speaks about exactly when you make the bracha. The bracha has to be immediately prior. With the moment you take it, you already fulfilled the mitzvah. One of the solutions that Tosfos offers, which is till today a minig by certain groups of Yidden, is to take one of them like the esrog upside down, and therefore you're not fulfilling the mitzvah. And indeed, Tanya Nami Hachi, that atzei shitim oimdim, the word oimdim placed after shitim, not prior to atzei, is to teach you that she'oimdim derech gedilasam, that they must stand upright, right, in the manner in which they grow. Now continues the Braisa Davar Acher, that the word oimdim, standing up, is also teaching you shema amidim es tzipuyon. So we know that in the Mishkan, these beams were plated with gold. Now, there's a certain relationship between the gold and the wood. On one hand, the gold is that which is more chashuv. That's good. It's gilded. But my friends, the gold, if it would not be placed on these strong beams, the gold would not be able to stand upright. What keeps up? What is oimed, the tzipuyon? The beams. And that's so meaningful because you have like the Beinani and the Tzaddik. So the Tzaddik is the gold. The Beinani, all of us, we're like the Atzei Shitin. But there is something that the gold is standing erect because it's connected to the people. There's a story that the Holy Baal Shem Tov, he would daven a very lengthy tefillos, or it was with the Magid, and sometimes like many hours. And one time the Talmidim felt, you know what? Why do we have to wait for the Rebbe to finish davening? He won't even know. We're going to go home. We're going to eat breakfast. We're going to come back, and then he's going to finish the silent Shemona Esrei. But when they came back, the Magid or the Baal Shem Tov or the Tzaddik already finished. He davened very quickly. So they told the Rebbe asked the Talmidim, why did you leave the shul? So they told him, to be honest, that you're davening so long, we can do stuff in the meanwhile. So that the Rebbe said that I am only able to really achieve what I achieved during silent Shemona Esrei when I daven alone because you are in the room. So based on your energy, based on your presence, I can climb even higher. And he gave that mashal of people, there was a hunter that wanted to chop a beautiful bird. The bird was on top of a tree. How does he get on top of the tree? He asked everyone, when you stand, Reuven stands on the shoulder of Shimon, who's standing on the shoulder of Levi, and then the hunter stands on top. If the guy in the bottom walks away, everyone collapses. So the gold is taka the most beautiful part, but it's what's keeping up the gold? The beams. Another interpretation, the word oimdim means it's internally here. A person, God forbid, might say that avat sivram, that their promise is gone, the promise of the Mishkan. The Mishkan was built by Moshe Rabbeinu. As history went on, when less of it was used in the Mishkan Shiloi, ultimately when very little of it was used in the Beis HaMikdash, it was hidden somewhere. Nignas. By nature, when you put these items in hiding, especially if it's under the ground, they decompose. And what they represent will also be gone. So lest a person think that avat sivram, that their promise is gone, ubatal sikuyim, and their hope is ruined. There's no Mishkan nowadays. There's no Mishkan in a revealed way. So that's why Talmud lemer atzei shitim oimdim. They are standing. Oimdim means she'oimdim la'oilme la'oilme alamim. That they stand forever. And as Chazal tell us, that the Moshe, everything that Moshe Rabbeinu did is forever, is nitzchiyim. And not only that, but we have a tradition that part of the third Beis HaMikdash, built into the third Beis HaMikdash, will be all of the parts of the Mishkan that was built by Moshe Rabbeinu, that they last forever, and they also therefore represent, and they express their lasting forever, that the hope and the promise is also always going to be with us. And the more agadatas of the same sources. V'amar Chizkiah, in the name of Rabbi Yirmiyah, Mishum Rav Shimon Bar Yochai, Yochalani lifted as kol olam kulei min adin, that I am able to pater. To pater means to find forgiveness, to take away any type of judgment over the entire world. From when until when? From the day I, Rashbi, was born until now, when he made that statement. In other words, all of the burden and the challenges that our imperfect behavior brings into the world, he was able to take all that upon himself. And then he went on to say, now from when until when? From the day he was born until when he made the statement. V'ilmale Eliezer b'ni imi, if my son will be willing to bear this burden with me, two people can carry not double the load, exponentially more weight, then we together are able to bear the burden from all of the iniquities that were done from the day the world was created until then. And then he said, the ilmala Yoisam ben Uzziah imanu, if Yoisam ben Uzziah, Rashi, 19 lines from the top of the Amid, says that he was a tzaddik and he was an ana of more than all of the other kings. And when his father became a leper and he took over his father's place, he always deferred kingship to his father. And look inside the Rashi and in the Melachim Beis to find out more about this unbelievable, humble Yid, humble king. That if he were join us, they have to, that tzaddik has to consent to bear the burden of the sins of the generation. But if we would have us three, then we are able not only in the back but in the future that we can pattern, we can exempt the entire world from judgment from the day it was created until the end of the world. The Yom Shenivra Olam Ba'at Soifli. Wow. And guys, there are different levels of tzaddikim, right? We have in Tanya, we have a Beinani, we have many levels in Beinani. We have generally two levels of tzaddikim, tzaddik she'eino gamur, tzaddik gamur, and one of the highest titles of a tzaddik, which means one of the highest levels of a tzaddik, is bnei Aliyah, the ones that are able to enter the highest. So the Shimon Bar Yochai spoke about the whole history of the world. That I see that if you were to go through the past generations and the future generations, how many tzaddikim reached the level bnei Aliyah? Very few. If it hit the whole history 1,000, I want you to know, ani ubeni mehem, me and my son are from them. If from the whole human history there's only 100, ani ubeni mehem, me and my son will be amongst them. And if shnayim heim, if from the whole human history there are only 2, that's me and my son. Ani ubani heim. Umi zutrei kulahai. Are there so few on this level? No, it's the max you're saying is only 1,000 or less. The Omar Rava, that Kamne Srei Alfei Dora Have, there are 18,000 rows. These are benches. And on every bench, whatever the number, it's a few tzaddikim considered on each bench. And they are all sitting, these benches are the Kamei Kutchabrichu and Lechuura, these are the benches. Those who merit to get are the ones in the group called Bnei Aliyah. 18,000 benches is a lot more than the max of 1,000 tzaddikim. And as it says, a pasuk in Yecheskel, Saviv, that around was Shmoina Asar Elef, a lot more than 1,000. Answers the Gemara. Hold on. Again, there are many levels of tzaddikim. Like Kasha. When Shimon Bar Yochai was speaking about Bnei Aliyah, and he mentioned that the most that there are is 1,000 are tzaddikim that are in the level the mistakli ba'aspeklario hameira, that they were able to see, to connect to godliness on a level of re'iyah. Obviously, God doesn't have any form. So when we're speaking about seeing, we're not picking up something the way we know what seeing means, but it means beruchni is what seeing means. And there's a concept of no one is able to see directly, but either you can see through this aspeklaria hameira. There's different ways of interpreting this word. We say this in the Bar Mitzvah Maimer. It either refers to a magnifying glass that's clear versus a magnifying glass that's opaque, or it just means a plane of glass. So even though they have to see it through some sort of masach, some sort of a partition, but it's completely see-through. That's only 1,000. When Rava made that statement based on the pasuk in Yecheskel that there are 18,000 rows upon which you have these great tzaddikim, this is from the whole human history, are taka great tzaddikim, and they can still be called bnei Aliyah, but the loy mistakli ba'aspeklaria hameira. Well, that they are unable to see it through this clear glass or through this magnifying glass, but they see it through the glass is already going to be a little bit of opaque. It's going to have a little bit of a film on it, and the level of re'iyah will be downgraded. Again, the Gemara is not happy. Again, is it that little? Don't forget, especially since Rashbi mentioned at the end that it might only be 2. How is that possible? Abaya says that loy pochus alma mitlasen b'shita tzaddikim. There's never less than 36 tzaddikim. Here you have the lamed vavniks, the mekabli ape shchina b'chol yom, that every day they know how to properly receive the shchina. And Shenemer, as it says in Tehillim, that Ashrei, or in Yeshaya, kol choichei loy, praiseworthy are those who wait for him. And it could have says, praiseworthy are those who wait. The word loy, lamed vav, is bigamatra tlasen b'shita havo. So again, it's a lot more than what seemingly Rashbi is saying. Answers the Gemara, loy kasher. Yes, the 36, the many more than the 2 that he mentioned, are taka tzadikim, that they can see godliness through the level or in the level of aspeklari or hameira, but the aili bebar, bar let's touch means permission. They can only reach that level. They can only go up a step with their permission. And what Rashbi ultimately said, that throughout the entirety of human history, there was a certain level that the highest was achieved only by the Rashbi and a son, that is Tzadikim, the Aili Beloibar, that can enter even without permission. You don't even have to get permission. You just knock on the door and you enter. Okay, weiter. Shas Petiros, and we are referring back to the Mishnah, that at the end of the seventh day, they would say words to either just to the Mizbeach. Tanakama says they would say, Yoifi locha Mizbeach, that all of this beauty is for you, Mizbeach. And then Rabbi Eliezer says that they would say words to the Mizbeach, to God and to the Mizbeach. Leka, liyutke, and lemizbeach, right? Leka ulecha Mizbeach. And they said it noch twice. Liyutke ulecha Mizbeach. Now here we have a problem. How do we have a problem? Asks the Gemara. They are joining together the name of God and something else. In other words, if they would only be saying words of praise to the altar, that's fine. That's fine. But to put the altar together with God, to God and to the altar, that's a borderline. That's getting into a gray area where we are giving an object too much reverence on the level of giving reverence to God. Did we not learn in a Braisa? Asks the Gemara that v'chol hamishtatef, whoever joins together, partners together, shem shamayim, and v'davar acher, that's a disrespecting God Almighty. And neker min ha'olam. Shenemer, as it says, and this is a pasuk that we have in Mishpatim. The pasuk says zoiveyach, and let's read the pshat, the first pshat Hanashi in Chumash, leloihim, that whoever who brings a korban to avodah zara, to God with a little g, to Getchkids, is Yocharam. And then the pasuk says, Bilti Lashem Labadi, that we only praise, we only give that level of kavod, we are only makriv korbanos to God, and we're not allowed to put anything else together with God. I just want to say that the Rishonim speak out, the Tosfos Harash speaks out, there are many psukim in the Torah that we spoke to God and to Moshe. Chatanu Bashem Vabach. We have psukim that he quotes from Gideon and other psukim where a tzaddik was put together. The Meiri says that's not a problem. Problem is an object that other peoples would give a certain amount of too much kavod, borderlining, imbuing in it some sort of deity power. So a mizbeach, we have to be careful. So how can he hold that they would praise leka and to you the mizbeach? So the Gemara says, no, that this is what they were saying. That liyutke, there would be moide, only moide, and to the mizbeach, there would be mishabeach. Now you have to know how to teach these words. So Rashi points out that, I'm reading inside the Rashi, that liyutke, to God, anu moidim, what are we moide? That God is our God. Now, what does God, our God, means? So there is different interpretations of the words moida. There is moida from submitting, and then and Rashi says it's not that. In Nisht, you'll find the Rashi over here. That the word moida is not hoid. You have to know how to type hoid. What is it? It's a lotion of thanksgiving. Thanksgiving we give to God. That's the only God. But then we say that ulocha anu mishabchim, to you the altar, we are mishabeach. In other words, instead of someone looking at the altar in a derogatory way, because it, so to say, consumes our animals, no, we're mishabeach. That would to you altar. But hoidah is only done to God Almighty. Yutke moedim, again, ulacha anu mekalslin, and to you the altar we will offer praise. Okay, then the Mishnah concluded that kamaseo b'choil, right? That's towards the end of the Mishnah. The same thing was done on Shabbos. The difference is that during the weekdays we would go around the mizbeach once, and on Shabbos, and I'm sorry, the seventh day, right? We would go around 7 times. In other words, we would do it on the 7th day. We would do the ceremony on the 7th day, even though it was Shabbos. We're not allowed to harvest on Shabbos. We did not. That's the Mishnah saying that they would harvest it prior to Shabbos and they would keep it fresh by putting it into golden barrels. Says the Gemara Amar Rafuna. Oh, Rabbi Yochanan ben Broika says in the Mishnah holds that they would take charuyoy dekel. They would take palm branches. Again, there's a machlokes whether they would do it according to Rabbi Yochanan ben Broika in addition to the aravos, or according to him, they did not take willows. They only took palm branches. Why would they take palm branches? So he answers. The Gemara says, Rafuna says, the chsiv kapois. We already had this above. Kapois is bolashon rabim. I know kapois is in context of taking the lulav for the dalat minim, but kapois is pronounced in plural. We know we only take one lulav. So what is it an allusion to? That aside of taking from the palm tree, the middle one, which is for the lulav, we also took branches for the biblical obligation in the Beis HaMikdash of the aravos, shnayim, achas lululav, achas lamizbeach. Now, the Rabbanan who disagree, they hold that it was not taken together with, it was certainly not only taken, there was no palm branches in the Arava ceremony. How do I kapois lashon abim? So the answer, we had this above, that since in the Chumash, the word kapois, it's pronounced kapois, the mikra, the pronouncement is in plural, but it's spelled, the aim lamasoidis is chaf pei sof, which will allow you to read it kapas, which is lashon yachid. The reason why God did not write it with the vav is to remind us it's really only one. Why is it written in plural? For other namazim, we want the leaves to be doubled over and other reasons. But actually, there's only one mitzvah from the palm, date palm, and that's the lulav and dafka, not the aravos. Rabbi Levi Oimer, another reason why Rabbi Yochanan ben Broika says that you take palm branches for the aravos is because ketamar, because since dates grow on the tree, and we, the Jewish people, are compared to a date. How? Ma tamar zeh, just like a date. And we're speaking about the palm date, the tree. Ein loy elo leiv echad, there's only one heart. Like Rashi says, that inside trees you have sap, which is like the soul of the tree. In many trees, in all of the trees, the sap doesn't only go through the trunk, but it goes from there into the various branches. A palm date tree, a tamar, the date tree, there is only sap in the center column and nowhere else. And the beauty of that is that it's a tree that only has one heart. There's only one soul. And that's the Yidden. Af Yisrael, ein lahem elo leiv echad, lavim shabashamayim. We are involved in many things, but where is our heart? There's only one, directed towards the one, to Hashem echad. Oh, okay. Now, Chevra, we're starting. We are starting the huge sugya of brachas, birchas hamitzvahs. When exactly do we make the bracha? We know is either prior to taking it. However, that means it by the lulav. When do we make the bracha on the sukkah? Interestingly, we paskin only prior to eating a su'udah. And then on top of that, we are very medagdek that if the wine is in context of the mitzvah of kiddush or havdalah, including havdalah, then we make a leishav basukah even when you only make havdalah. And there's no havdalah b'makim su'udah, so there's nothing else that you need to eat. Other than that, but we make the bracha how many times? So nowadays, we make a bracha on the lulav every time we take it, every day. Nowadays, when you dwell in the sukkah, you make a bracha prior to which, leishav basukah. You don't say make a bracha on the first day for lulav for all of the Yom Tov. We don't say make a bracha leishav basukah the first time for the whole Yom Tov. But as we'll see here in the Gemara, there's going to be three opinions. So let's start. Guys, remember, this is said in the name of Shmuel, that indeed, lulav Shiva, every day of the 7 days. We know excluding Shabbos. It's just every day aside of Shabbos, when we take the lulav, you also make a bracha. However, the Sukah yoim echad, wow. According to Shmuel, you would only make the bracha leishav basukah one time. When? The first time you dwelled in the Sukkah. And that bracha extended and it was good for the entirety of Yom Tov. What's the difference? My tamo, lulav, the mifseki leilois miyamim, since the mitzvah of lulav is, as we learned above, only during the daytime, not during the nighttime, which means the nights interrupt even your ability of doing the mitzvah. Of course, do the mitzvah in the morning, but we learned this last week. If a person didn't take the lulav in the morning, they can take it all the way up until the end of the daytime of the day. But at night, you cannot take it. So the nights make an interruption. So therefore, since the nights make an interruption, we view every day as a standalone day. Kol yoima mitzvah ba'apinavshu. and therefore every day make a new bracha. However, the end of the narrow line, Sukah, when it comes to the mitzvah of Sukah, since the loy mafsike lois miyamin, there is no interruption. It's day and night, day and night. It's gavaldik. You're obligated to dwell by day. You're obligated to dwell at night. So therefore, kulu shiva kechad yoyma arichadamu. Words that are normally applied in the context of Rosh Hashanah are applied here in a more limited way. But since it's one continuum, therefore, I'll make one bracha. Even if you walked out, the fact that you are always obligated to dwell, so there is no interruption. And therefore, Shmuel holds you make a bracha once for the entire 7 days. That's shita number 1. So remember, Shmuel, Lulav 7, Sukah 1. The opposite opinion is Rabba Bar Chana in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. What's the opposite? Sukah Shiva. Every time, every day, you make another bracha. However, Lulav only once. My Tama, now the Gemara says, what's the reason of this? I'm saying Rabba Bar Chana Amar Rabbi Yochanan because we're going to learn later another Amoira quoting Rabbi Yochanan differently. But Rabba Bar Chana Amar Rabbi Yochanan holds, third line from the bottom, Sukah, which we are obligated in the temple, outside the temple, all the same. Midai Raisa, we're obligated to dwell for 7 days. So therefore, we make a bracha each day of the 7 days. We actually make the bracha more than 7 times. We're not going to get into this right now. If a person was in a sukkah and they left the sukkah for enough time and they come back on the same day, you constantly will be making brachas. But lulav only has to be taken on the first day midai Raisa. The taking of the lulav for the rest of Yom Tiv was only enacted, as we learned, by Rabbi Yochanan, right, Ben Zakkai, after the Churban Beis HaMikdash, in remembrance of the temple. So it's only midrabanan. So sagilei b'chad yoimo. Now, what's very important, Chavra, we're going to repeat this in the beginning of the next year, is that now not only did we speak last week about the big machlokes between Tosfos and between Tosfos, Rashi and Tosfos and the Rambam regarding making brachas for a minhag. And as we expressed the limit, it's really not always there. Some minhagim, minhag aviseinu b'yodenu, second day Yom Tov, everyone says you make a bracha, let's say to eat matzah, which is really on the first day. On the other hand, everyone is in agreement that for the minhag neviim, not Yisoid neviim of taking the aravos on the Hoshana Rabbah on the 7th day, no one makes a bracha. But there are many areas like Chatzi Halal that we learned the Machlokes Rishonim, all the way down to Machlokes Mechaber Rabbah, whether you make a bracha for a minhag. Now we're learning something new. Now we're learning that there is a Machlokes Amoraim, whether you make a bracha for a rabbinic obligation. There are those who say that if something is only a takana of the Chachamim, you don't make a bracha. Because again, you're saying, you God, Vitzivanu. Now the other side is Vitzivanu, we learned this last week, Loisasu. A pasuk in Parshas Shoftim, but not all of the Amoraim subscribe to that. So this explanation, B'shitas Rabba Bar Chana Amar Rabbi Yochanan, is that since the taking of the lulav from the 2nd day on is only midrabanan, yes, it's a takanas rabbanan. You don't make brachas for rabbinic rules, and therefore you can't make a bracha on the lulav other than the first day. That's opinion number 2. And now we're going to learn opinion number 3, and we'll finish the share with the third shita. Ki asa Ravin. When he came to Babel from Eretz Yisrael, he quoted Rabbi Yochanan, right, the big posek in Eretz Yisrael, and his version was Echad Zeh ve'Echad Zeh Shiva. Side the lulav and the sukkah you make on all 7 days. By the way, we paskin like Rava's version of Rabbi Yochanan. Now, it's common that there would be a machlokes amoraim what Rabbi Yochanan said. There is such a machlokes as to what did he say regarding the lulav. But regarding what Rabbi Yochanan says for the sukkah, both Rabba Bar Chana and Ravin agree that Rabbi Yochanan says that for sukkah you make a bracha every day, not like Shmuel that said sukkah only 1 day. And there is a big klal in halacha, Chavra. We'll conclude with that. Whenever you have a machlokes between Shmuel and Rabbi Yochanan, Shmuel was the master in Babel, Rabbi Yochanan was the master in the Holy Land. The halacha follows Rabbi Yochanan, and therefore Amar Rabbi Yosef. The last line of the Amid, Nekoit the Rabba Bar Chana b'yotcha. Nekoit the Rabba Bar Chana, Rashi says, is only regarding sukkah. We're not focusing on lulav. We don't paskin like Rabba Bar Chana in the name of Rabbi Yechanan regarding lulav. We do make a bracha every day of the 7 days, other than on Shabbos when we don't take it. But we're focusing on Sukah. That why do we make a bracha all of the 7 days on Sukah? Since the kulu amoirohi kaimi kavase b'Sukah, like we just mentioned, Sai Rabba Bar Bar Chana, Sai Ravin, both agree that Rabbi Yechanan said that for Sukah you make a bracha all of the 7 days. So really, regarding Sukah, it's a machlekes between two, Rabbi Yechanan and Shmuel. Like Rashi writes at the end of the Amid, and the klal in halacha is Shmuel and Rabbi Yechanan, halacha ke Rabbi Yechanan. And therefore, we paskin that we make a bracha every day in the Sukkah. A lot more regarding this to be continued. What a daf. Shem Ab. I want you to know that it's a terrible thing that this Shem Ab became printed and it's all over the place. There's a tremendous amount of kedusha. If anyone has in their possession the Shem Ab, they should be going as it. Now, I also know that the other Sfarim from people that we completely respect and rely on, also recently, you can find, I think, the Shem Ab in the Sefer HaBoyer that was translated by Rabbi Aber Kaplan. That's fine. If you got permission.
What's the Shem Ab?
Shem Ab, Baruch, is when we speak about God's holiest name. Shem, it's known as the Shem HaMafurash. So we learned in the beginning of the class that this is the Rashi tells us exactly where do you find it in the Chumash, how do you put it together, and it's good. It should stay on Sukah Daf Mem Hey in Rashi without people getting cared. They won't know where to find it. It's really better that way. It's a terrible thing. People rave it on their body. They tour on the Tzkefrelach. What happened now with the Shem Ab? A little bit of a desecration. Okay, all right. With the help of Hashem, we are learning Sukah Daf Mem Vav. We left off all the way at the bottom of Daf Mem Hey, Amid Beis. We just finished learning a big machlokes as to, this is the topic, do we make a bracha every day of the 7 days for the lulav? Do we make a bracha every day of the 7 days for sitting in the sukkah? Or do you only make a bracha on the first day, at the first time, and that's going to suffice for the entire Yom Tov? And we're going to continue that sugya and add another bracha that is made, and that is the bracha of Shehechiyanu. Now, the blessing of Shehechiyanu is only said the first time. Parenthetically, outside Eretz Yisrael, where we keep 2 days Yom Tov, here we'll make Shehechiyanu both days, the first and the second day. That's because it began by us not knowing if the first day was the first day, meaning the second day is really the first day, which would mean that the Shehechiyanu that we said on what we thought was the first day really wasn't valid. So we say it twice, but the concept of Shehechiyanu is only said once. The question will be, when is Shehechiyanu recited? And that's already going to lead us into a topic that we have written in the Gemara in Yerushalmi. There is an opinion there that says that when you build a sukkah, you make a bracha shekedishanu b'mitzvayse v'tzivanu to make a sukkah. Chag HaSukkah is taselacha. We don't paskin that way in the Babli. Nevertheless, since you can only fulfill the mitzvah of dwelling in a sukkah if there is a built sukkah, so we will attribute some chashivus of the mitzvah itself, some importance of the mitzvah, to the building of the sukkah, as we'll see in our sugya. And that's going to open up the topic regarding many other blessings. The blessing that we make before we put on tefillin. We're going to have again on Daf Mem Vav, as we just learned at the end of the Daf Mem Hey, a machlokes between Amoraim whether brachos b'chlal are made prior to fulfilling a rabbinic obligation. Yes, we paskin that we make brachas before all of the drabanans. Minig is where we have the question whether you make a bracha prior to a minig. But in the Gemara we have a machlokes whether you make brachas. In other words, do you make a bracha before you light the Hanukkah candles? And by the way, we're going to have another whole discussion about what bracha do you make before the Hanukkah candles, what happens if you are unable to light it, whether you make a bracha simply by seeing someone's Hanukkah candle, etc. And then we're going to come back to what we learned on the Mishnah Daf Mem Hey, and that is that the oilam, they would eat the esrog on the 7th day of Sukkot, and the question will be, from what time are you allowed to use the esrog and the other species? From what time are you allowed to use the schach, and according to some opinions, even the walls of the sukkah for mundane purposes? What's the question? So there was a concept of once an item was designated for a mitzvah use, even if it never gets imbued with intrinsic holiness, even if it's not tashmishe kedusha, even if it's not your tefillin or your mezuzah or even your sefer, anything that has the words of scripture written on it, even if it's invalid, it still has a vestige of holiness, and we can't just use it for mundane purposes. We have to put it aside, we have to hide it, we have to bury it. It's called geniza. You have to be goiniz it. When it comes to mitzvah's item, after it's being used, it doesn't have that level of holiness, but during the time of its designation, then it may not be used for anything else. So we're going to borrow a term that we have in the laws of Shabbos. When it comes to muktzah for Shabbos, there's a concept called migoy, the iskatsoi, lebein hashmoshes. Once it was already considered muktzah during twilight, iskatsoi lekula yom. It remains muktzah for the whole Shabbos. Now, the actual meaning by Shabbos and here is not the same, but it's very similar, and we are borrowing the same phrase. In other words, do we say that since on the 7th day of Sukkot, there is a mitzvah to use the lulav and the esrog, the dalad minim, so migoy the iskatsoi on the 7th day, even after you fulfill the mitzvah, that those items cannot be used for mundane purposes. For example, you can't eat your esrog. Or do we say, no, it was only designated for the mitzvah. So before you fulfilling the mitzvah on the 7th day, you can't use it for anything else. But once you did the mitzvah, even on the 7th day, you can already use it for your own. And the same thing will be regarding the sukkah on the 8th day. As we will see, can you use the schach for firewood or for any other personal use? Some people say that the question is also regarding the walls. And that's going to lead us into the final topic of Daf Mem Vav, which will go into Daf Mem Zayin, is until when do you have to dwell in the sukkah? Now, we know from the Torah we have to dwell in the sukkah for all 7 days. But in Chutz La'aretz, we have a doubt as to when the first day is, when the 7th day is. So we are dwelling in the sukkah on the 8th day, but here we have a problem. The problem is that when we make Kiddush on the 8th day, the Nusach, the name that we give to the 8th day is Shmini Atzeres. When you make Kiddush, you don't say Chag HaSukkos, you say Shmini Atzeres. So you have to be consistent. If you're saying Shmini Atzeres, why are you sitting in the sukkah? Or as we will see, as actually we paskin sit in the sukkah, we sit in the sukkah on the 8th day, but you no longer can make the bracha to sit in the sukkah, because then you're not going to be consistent, and much, much more. Let us start on Daf Memhei, Amid Beis, all the way, the last word in the Amid, Meisvei. We just finished paskening like Rabbi Yechanan regarding sukkah. Even though there were two versions, what Rabbi Yechanan said, they both ascribe that. Rabbi Yechanan says, unlike Shmuel, Rabbi Yechanan says that for Sukkah you make the bracha all of the 7 days. Meisvei, Flekting Gemara, I have a Tana of a Braisa that appears to be saying the opposite during Daf Mem Vav. When you make a lulav, when do we making the lulav means binding the lulav. And even though, again, we don't paskin like Rabbi Yehuda, you don't have to bind it, but it's hidur mitzvah, even according to the Chachamim, to bind the lulav with the other two, to have the bundle. Being that ideally you bind it by making a knot, and you may not make a permanent knot on Yom Tiv, so the binding should happen prior to Yom Tiv. So says the Braisa that while you are binding your own, and that's essential, your own, not for someone else but yours, you make the bracha, Baruch she'achiyanu v'kimanu v'higiyanu l'zman hazeh. We bless God for God. The fact is God is giving us life, and God is sustaining us, and God brought us to this season. And b'chlal, any seasonal activity that brings us joy, whether it's doing a seasonal mitzvah, even when it's doing something mundane, permitted, mundane, that brings us joy, something that doesn't happen every day, but only seasonal, only every now and then, that justifies making the shechiyanu. So our Tana is saying that when you make the lulav, you can make the shechiyanu. Nitlay lotzes by, but when you take it, meaning on the first day, then you say Baruch with God's name and Shem Malchus, Shem Malchus, Asher Kedishanu Mitzvah Sivitzivanu Al Natilas Lulav. Wow. The Afal Pisha Birach Olav Yoim Rishon. This Braisa says clearly, and that will be against Rabba Bar Chana's statement in the name of Rabbi Yechanan that you make the bracha every of the 7 days, like Rav and Amar Rabbi Yechanan, but not like Rabba Bar Chana, as we learned at the end of last daf. Similarly, When you're building a sukkah for yourself, obviously prior to Yom Tov, one may not build on Yom Tov. Just the building itself justifies for you to say the Shechiyanu blessing, Baruch Shechiyanu V'Kimanu, etc. Now, just parenthetically, if I build a sukkah more than 30 days before Sukkot, you won't make the Shechiyanu. Detail, this has to be done within the 30 days. Nichnas leishav ba on Yom Tov, then you say Hashekadishanu Mitzvah Mitzvah leishav Sukkah. And here again, the Braisa writes, the Kivan Shebeirach Yom Rishon, once you make the bracha on the first day, Shuv Eina Mevarach. Wow. So Sukkah, Lulav, you make it all 7. This is Mamish like Shmuel, Lulav Shiva, and Sukkah only 1 day. So this is actually a problem both by Lulav and Sukkah against the Rabba Bar Bar Chana. Kasha Lulav Lulav, Kasha Sukkah Sukkah, because Rabba Bar Bar Chana says in the name of Rabbi Yechanan that Rabbi Yechanan said the opposite, that Sukkah you make every day, and Lulav you only make the first day. Now, before we go further, the top Tosfos is illuminating. Says Tosfos, Ha'oisa Sukkah La'atzmo, Dafka Naka La'atzme. First of all, this shita that you make a Shechiyanu when you build it is only when you build your own Sukkah. We'll see why this is important. But if you build someone else's Sukkah, Lo Mevarach Midi. Now, Tosfos tells us that you should know that in the Yerushalmi there is another opinion that's not brought down over here, and that opinion is that when you build the sukkah, you can make the bracha shekedishanu b'mitzvaysa v'tzivanu la'asoi sukkah. Where did God command us to make a sukkah? So the drasha will be Chag HaSukkah is tasa, but it's much more than that. There is an opinion in the Talmud Yerushalmi that says that since God obligates me to dwell in the sukkah, but how will I dwell in a sukkah if I won't build a sukkah? Now the truth is I can dwell in your sukkah, ein chanami, but someone's got to build a sukkah. There has to be a sukkah. So whoever is building the sukkah can make a bracha. And actually, Tosfos adds that according to that opinion, that you make a bracha lasei sukkah, then even if I'm building your sukkah, I would also make the lasei sukkah. I'm building a sukkah for you, me, for you, for us. Our Gemara does not subscribe to that. Our Gemara subscribes that the building of the sukkah is a preliminary, needed, but it's not the mitzvah itself. And that's the chiddush of our Tana, that even though we don't view the preliminary as an actual mitzvah, you cannot say Asher Kedishanu b'mitzvah and you commanded me to build, yet a Shechayanu you are allowed to say. You are allowed to say. Now, we're going to come back a little bit later in the Amid, and we'll see where our custom comes from. Obviously not from this Braisa. We nowadays don't make a Shechayanu when we build. We don't make a Shechayanu when we bundle. We do make the Shechiyanu on the first time we're sitting in the sukkah and the first time we take the lulav. But before we get to how we do, here it's a contradiction, a total contradiction against Rabba Bar Bar Chana Amar Rabbi Yechanan. And the Gemara begins to answer. Bishleim lulav is not a problem because I can argue that the Braisa that we just quoted is during the times of the Holy Temple. And here again, we're going to have this opinion that a bracha is not made, according to many opinions, on any rabbinic obligation. So in the Holy Temple, Lifnei Hashem v'samachtem, you have to take the lulav all the 7 days. That's where the Braisa says you make a bracha all 7 days. Rabbi Yechanan, he lived in the Holy Land, but he lived after the Churban, is speaking about Bisman She'ein Beis HaMikdash Kayim. So therefore, since the 6 final days of Sukkot is only a rabbinic obligation, there's only a chiyuv midrabanan, you don't make a bracha at all. But the problem will be Elo Sukah Asukah Kasha. Rabbi Yechanan says, and even Ravan also holds that Rabbi Yechanan says that you make a bracha all 7 days. His Braisa is saying that you only make a bracha the first time. And the Gemara says it must be that it's a machlokes Tanoim. You're right, but there's another Tana. And once you have an argument from the era of the Tanoim, it's easier for a Amoida to side with any one of those two, as does Rabbi Yechanan. Tanoi, the Tanya. It's amazing how this Tanya is not speaking about Sukkah, it's speaking about Tefillin. And we are comparing Sukkah to Tefillin. And what's the question by Tefillin? Tefillin, Zaktatana, calls man shemanichan mevarach aleim. Every time you put them on, even during the same day, says Rashi 3 lines from the top of the Amid, a person davens, he puts on Tefillin, takes them off for whatever reason. You put them on the same day, again you make a bracha. Every time you do it, you make a bracha. So holds Rebbe. Gavaldik. Now, Rashi already tells us the comparison between Sukkah and Tefillin. Let's read Rashi 3 lines from the top. Oh, the gabe Sukah nami. At the end of last year, we learned that what would be the logic to make a bracha every single time, or to make it only once? Is there a halachic interruption? And when it comes to a sukkah, there is no interruption, because since we're obligated to dwell day and night, it's like one long continuum. So what, says the Gemara now? The daytime of the day is also one long continuum. Yet the Rebbe says every time you took it off and then you re-put on the tefillin, you make a new bracha. So therefore, every time you leave the sukkah and you come back in, you make another bracha. Nevertheless, because it's mamish like tefillin. That's such a great comparison. So when we have Rabbi Yochanan that says that sukkah shiva, like Rebbe, you put it on, you make a bracha every time you put on tefillin during the same day. So every time you dwell in the sukkah, you make another bracha. You only make it in the morning. And Rashi here again says, and according to that, by sukkah, it's not only once during the day. Since we are obligated to dwell in the sukkah day and night, so we view all of the 7 days of sukkah as like one long day, but you only make a bracha in the beginning of the one long day. And that will be the Tana that we have above, that you only make it once. Well, so now let's go back to this question regarding tefillin. When it was stated, Abaya paskins like Rebbe, which will be consistent with also paskin like Rabbi Yochanan. However, Rava paskins like Rabbanon. It will be a little bit problematic because the rule is Abaya and Rava halachic kirava, aside of Yal Kegam. And by Sukah we paskin like Rabbi Yochanan. Shmuel the Rabbi Yochanan halachic Rabbi Yochanan. And here Rava's paskining like the Rabbanon. What did the Rabbanon say? They only make a bracha once. Amar Rav Mani Bera, the Bas Shmuel, Rav Mani, who was the son of the daughter of Shmuel, his father's name was Isser. And there was a story that's not that doesn't speak so great about Isser that we don't mention. We sometimes don't even mention his name. He's known as the grandson of Shmuel. That Chazino Leila Rava, like we mentioned, I actually saw Rava Dolei Ovid Kishmait say. He doesn't paskin that you only make a bracha on tefillin once during the day. No, when Rava would remove his tefillin for enough time and then he would put it back on, he would make a bracha again on the same day. Now it's great. That's why we get the paskin like Rabbi Yochanan by Sukah, and that's consistent with us actually paskining like Rava. What did Rava do? This is already a witness of Bepoel Mamish, and that's a klal that a Amoira and any Rav, the older you get, the more learned you get, you can retract your original opinion. And Rava retracted. Rava, first of all, because of Gufnaki, was very careful. On one hand, Zrizin Magdim and Lemitzvahs. By tefillin, not that quick, because they were tefillin for a long amount of time. They basically wore the entirety of the day. They wanted to make sure that their bowels are cleaned out. So first, Rava would get up and he would relieve himself. And Venafik, he would leave the latrine. Where's Danny? And Umasha Yadeh, and he would wash his hands. And then Umanach Tefillin, and he would put on Tefillin with a bracha. But if he would have to relieve himself again, then he would go into a latrine, which means he would have to remove his tefillin. He would enter a place in which you may not wear tefillin. That's a halachic interruption. And he would leave again. You have to wash your hands. Rava retracted his original opinion, and now we also follow Rebbe, umevarchin kol shiva. Therefore, memela. Now that we juxtaposed, we compared Sukah to Tefillin, so we also make a bracha during the 7 days, not only once in the beginning. Amar Mazutra, Chazina leit l'Rav Papi. So Papa means Atata and Papi means Azeda. So they called him Rav Papi. The Chol Emas, the Manach Tefillin. Every time you put on Tefillin on the same day, also mevarich. Again, this is all just to back up. No one should come and say, Abaye v'Rava halachic kirava. Not over here. Rava himself retracted. Rabbanan devei Ravashi, the students of the yeshiva of Ravashi, the Rabbanan kol emes the mashmushay bohu, something even more. Not only when they removed it and put it back on, every time they would touch their tefillin, they would touch the tefillin while it's on them, they would make a new bracha. Now hold on, here there's a big discussion about that. there is a very important Tanan that says that true, theoretically, that's what should have happened. Every time you readjust it on you, you should make a new bracha. But there is a certain time limit that if you move it too often, there is a certain minimum amount of time that has to pass for you to be obligated to make a bracha again. And then the Ran says, we don't know what that time limit is. And that's why nowadays, we don't make a bracha every time we move the tefillin around. Also happens to be that when we touch the tefillin various times during davening, that's for sure within that time limit. So b'chlal, there's no shaila that we de facto don't make a bracha. But people that wore the tefillin the entire day, it's not only removing it, going to the bathroom and putting it back on, but then when they would just touch it, readjust it, they would make a bracha again. Okay, Amar Rav Yehuda Mashmuel. So now that we resolved the Sukah, we paskin like Rabbi Yochanan, which is like Rebbe, because it's both Abaya and Rava and many others. Amar Rav Shmuel, mitzvahs lulav kol shivam. All right, that's what we learned yesterday. That on the lulav you make a bracha not only the first time, but you make it every single day. But Rabbi Shua ben Levi Amar, no, Yom Rishon mitzvahs lulav. Mina Torah, we're only obligated to take the lulav, the dalad minam on the first day, which means that is why you make a bracha. Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi subscribes to the opinion that we don't make brachas for the rabbanans. Wow! And mikan ve'elach, since it's only mitzvah zekenim, not God forbid in a disrespectful way, but brachas are not made for the mitzvahs of the elders. Rabbi Yitzchak Amar kol yoyma mitzvah zekenim, va'afilo yoyim rishon. Hold on, that no day he agrees that you don't make a bracha for the rabbanan. He appears to be saying, well, then don't even make a bracha on the first day. It's all rabbinic. So the Gemara says, how can you say that? No, but we already accepted the rule that on the first day, even outside the temple, taking the lulav everywhere is midayiraisa. So we have to amend the words of Rabbi Yitzchak. No, what he meant to say was, he agrees that you don't make a bracha on a derabanan. So what he said was that bar miyoyim rishon, aside of the first day, don't make a bracha. He's saying exactly the same thing of Rabbi Shua ben Levi. Indeed, add the word v'chein of Rabbi Yitzchak. Further says the Gemara, Af Rav Sobar Kol Shiva Mitzvahs Lulav. The first version is that even though we don't have a tradition of what Rav said explicitly, but we can extrapolate that the Shitas Rav will be that he will hold, in spite of it being a midrabanan, you make a bracha all of the 7 days. Where do we see from Rav, if he didn't say it explicitly regarding lulav, that you make a bracha even when you are fulfilling only so to say a derabanan? Here we go to Chanukah. So when lulav, Sukah, Tefilla, Chanukah. Hamad liknei shel Chanukah, when you light the Chanukah candle, tzarich levarech, gavaldik, is araya. Chanukah is purely midrabanan. You make a bracha for the rabbanan. Rabbi Yirmiyah Amar, I'll tell you more. It's not only when you light them in later, but even when only horoya ner shel Chanukah, if you only see the Chanukah light, you already have to make a bracha. Now the Mordechay says over here regarding if you see the candle of Chanukah, you have to make a bracha. That only refers to someone who's not planning to light it for whatever reason. We paskin like the Mordechay. So when you see a Chanukah menorah, since we plan to light the menorah on our own, then we don't make the bracha when we see it. And that leads us into the whole beauty and upside side of just knowing what the Rebbe says to do Mitzvah on Chanukah. But if someone, God forbid, won't be lighting the menorah, then there is a fulfillment of their mitzvah when they see the menorah. Now the question is, what bracha is made? And really the question is double. Now that we established that there are times that only seeing the menorah, you make a bracha. What bracha do you make over there? Now the bracha of lahadlik ner means lighting. If you are seeing it, as we'll see, that bracha you cannot make. The other bracha you do make. Let's go inside. Amar Rav Yehuda, like this. Yom Rishon, on the first day of Chanukah, Hamadlik, the one that's lighting, Mevarech Shalosh, will make 3 blessings. And on the first day of Chanukah, Horoya, when you see it for the first time, you can only make 2 brachas. Which one do you omit the first? You can say Sha'as Nisim. You can say Shechayanu, and you say it. Lahadlik, you can't say. When you light it, you do all 3. Mikan ve'elach, after the first time that you lit it, Madlik Mevarech Shtayim, Lahadlik Ner Sha'as Nisim, and V'haroya only Sha'as Nisim, because Shechayanu is only said the first time of that season. This question is on the one who lights. What's the text of the blessing? It says the Gemara, Baruch, and again, it's a given. You say God's holy name. You affirm that God is the king in the world. Shem umalchus, any bracha without Shem umalchus is not a bracha. Chanukah, how beautiful is it? You see in our Gemara already this whole origin of the question whether you say shell. Our minik Chabad is we don't say shell, as in the Gemara, shell is in parentheses. It depends what the text was over here. Again, now that we mentioned there's a machlekes amoraim, whether you make a bracha prior to fulfilling a rabbinic rule, it's a rabbinic rule. So where did you command us? Answers the Gemara, pasuk in Shoftim. The Torah says, don't deviate from what the sages tell you, even though it's a general statement. So what? When I am lighting Hanukkah, I'm fulfilling the negative commandment of not deviating. Another source in the Chumash that gives the rabbinic laws a d'oraisa power, pasuk in Ha'azinu, not in the negative but in the positive. Ask your elders and they will tell you. Gavaldik. In other words, we have both for an asay and for a lav, a empowerment to the chachamim that justifies us saying in our bracha, you God commanded us. We can even read the parentheses. Now, there's only two from the second day on. Which one do we not say? Zman. We don't say shechayanu. Asks the Gemara why. Maybe the Braisa means don't say sha'asa nisim. The Gemara says no, that we can't say because neis kol yoma isay. Right, by Hanukkah there was a miracle every day. You know the famous question: why is it 8 days, only 7 days? There was a miracle every day, so you can't omit the sha'asa nisim. Which one do you omit? The shechayon. Rav Nachman by Yitzchak had another version that for us to know what Rav holds, you don't have to extrapolate it. Rav said his position. Rav opined by Hanukkah you make a bracha. So you make a bracha every day for lulav. No, Rav said it befedish. Masna lo behedya that Omar Rav kol shiva mitzvahs lulav. You don't have to learn it from implication from Hanukkah. Weiter. Tana Rabbanu we learned in a Braisa. Ha'isa sukkah la'atzmai. We learned above, when you make a sukkah for yourself, you are then already able to say the shechayanu. When you come and sit and eat on it on the first day, meaning the first night, because sukkah is day and night, then you already say Asher Kedeshanu v'chulei. What happens if what happens if you did not build a sukkah? You're using someone else's sukkah, which you are allowed to do with their permission. What happens if it's a communal sukkah? So if prior to the holiday's onset, Erev Yom Tov, you are able to add the layer of schach. For those who have a minute to hang the beautifications, add noya sukkah, then you can make the shechayanu when you add, but you have to be active. But if you did not add anything, then you make the shechayanu when you eat there the first time. You make both brachas. And actually, Amar Avashi, I saw the great Rav Kahana, right? The Kahana that we just learned about on Daf Mem Daled, the Nashi, that Rav Kahana impressed Rabbi Yechanan that much. He was a Charif, that he lechatchila said everything in the Kiddush. The Ka'amar Lulu Kula Kasa the Kiddush, and we follow Shitas Rav Kahana. Because we are not noyek to make a shechayanu when you build it, even though you could. And it's explained the reason why we follow more the Shita of Rav Kahana is because it was relatively common, especially in the times of Chazal, for people to share sukkahs one with the other. So and only the builder gets to make a shechayanu. And I would add, similarly, it's very common now, especially when we make the types of bindings that we do in Chabad, that not everyone knows how to make it. It's common that one guy does it for all. You know, you pay someone to do it, a bacher does it. Or however, I do it for you, you do it for me. So instead of having one guy saying shechayanu when they make it for themselves, and someone else saying shechayanu when they use it, it became a standard. The shechayanu was made the first time. Sai, when we take the lulav, we make the shechayanu when we take it. And Sai, when it comes to sukkah, we make the shechayanu with all of the differences between the first night and the second night, where it is placed in Kiddush. But let's go right and it's getting late. If you are facing many mitzvahs, an amazing Rashi, an important Rashi for the Ashkenazim. What's the many mitzvahs? Rashi gives an example. If you have in front of you the lulav that you didn't take yet, you have the sukkah that you did not dwell in yet, you have tefillin in front of you that you did not put on yet, you have your tzitzis that you did not put on yet. Tefillin, sukkahs, certainly not on Yom Tov. Here, clearly, that's one of the sources that Shitas Rashi is that you put on tefillin on Chalamoid. Anyway, that's not our minhag, but let's go back over here. So notice, if a person is about to do many mitzvahs, so this opinion holds, this Tana holds, you don't specify brachas. You make one blessing for all. You say, Asher Kedishonu v'mitzvaysa v'tzivanu al ha-mitzvahs. And then you put in your talis and you put in your tefillin, and then you take the lulav. Or if you take the lulav before talis and tefillin, and then you continue eating in the sukkah, you covered it all. However, Rabbi Yehuda Oimer, and we paskin like the Tana Rabbi Yehuda, no, every mitzvah gets its own bracha. Mevarach al kol bracha, mevarach al kol achas v'yachas b'fnei atzmo. It's amazing. And I'll tell you why it's amazing. Because when you make a bracha, especially al pi chasidus, bracha miloshan hamavrachas hagafanim, bracha means I'm drawing down godliness, and you're preparing yourself to do that prior to each mitzvah. If you're focusing on the godliness, there's one God. You're drawing down one elikus. If you're focusing in what, then every mitzvah has its own unique keli to be mekabel, its own level of elikus. So if you're focusing on the oid, you would make one bracha. If you're focusing on the keli, then you would make each and every bracha. Or to word it differently, if the ikar inyan of the mitzvah would be for us to go up milmata l'mayla, we're going up to one God. If the main kavana and al pi chasidus, and that's here halacha, the main kavanah is dira b'tachtonim, so you're focusing in the world. The world is diverse. The world is many. Okay, right. The halacha is Rabbi Yehuda. Each mitzvah gets its own separate blessing. My Talmud Rabbi Yehuda. What's the source? Passing in Tehillah. It says in Tehillah, Baruch Hashem, Yom Yom, blessed is God day by day. 1 second, day by day. It's only by day. What does that mean? Elot means that every day has its own bracha. In other words, just like we view every day as a unique unit in time, which we do. It's one God, but we're bringing God down into every single day separately. Baruch Hashem Yom Yom. So as it is in Zman, since we know that space, Makoim, is a manifestation of Zman, they're really the same creation, Zman u'Makoim. So if in Zman we emphasize Yom Yom, so in the places and the physical things of the world, in the talis and in the tefillin, and in the sukkah and in the lulav, each one gets its own bracha. That's kind of amazing of finding in Nigla the link between time and space. Come and see. Another area from the many areas, from the infinite areas that God Almighty and we people have an infinite gap where we are completely dissimilar. Midas Basar V'dam, in the laws of nature, when it comes to people, Klei Reikon, when you have an empty vessel, Dafka, empty vessel, Dafman Vavamat base, then it's Machzik. If something is empty, then there is room in which to put stuff in. You want to fill your cup with water, the cup has to prior to that be empty. If the cup is full, Male, ain't a Machzik, there's no room. But Avol Midas HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the opposite. That's because of God, not because of us. That if you have a Yid, that's a filled vessel, he's filled with Torah and filled with mitzvahs, he will be able to be machzik, he will be able to retain even more godliness. Reikon, if a person chose to be emptied, God forbid, of the above, then the little that he does won't even be retained. Eino machzik. Shenamar, as it says, many sources. One is, V'hoye im shomaya tishma. This is not shomaya tishma'u. This is from the Teichacha, because there's a negative implication over here. Im shomaya tishma. If you already chose to hear, then you will absorb even more. The fuller you are, the more room you will have. How beautiful. But if a person chose not to listen, then if the choice of doing it from now on in the beginning will be more difficult. Of course, there's tshuva, but im lav loy tishma, or davar acher. Im shomaya b'yashan, then tishma b'chadash. Many people think that they want to innovate, which is beautiful. Before you innovate, learn the old. That's such an important rule. We are obligated to be machadish. But how can you be machadish if you don't know what was said? First, you have to learn the old, and then you'll be able to channel new insights. But if you're going to turn your heart away, shuv leisishma, you will unable to retain the new that you are trying to say. Okay. Weiter. The Mishnah on Daf Mem Hey spoke about here. Finally, the end of the Mishnah that at the end of Yom Tiv, the meaning was that the elders would snatch the Dalad Minim from the hands of the children. Really, they would snatch it from each other, and everyone would eat up the Esrogim. Okay, so now when did they eat it? There's the snatching and there's the eating. When were they allowed to eat it? Says the Mishnah. What's the issue? Like we mentioned, hold on. The esrog was designated for a mitzvah. Could you use the esrog for mundane purposes? Well, the mitzvah has to be over. Does the mitzvah have to be over? Does the day in which there was a mitzvah, does the day have to be over? So that's the topic. Omar Rabbi Yechanan, that the esrog in the entire 7th day is asur, even after performing the mitzvah. Because Rabbi Yechanan subscribes to the same concept that we have by the laws of Muktzah on Shabbos, that migoy de iskatzoy lebein hashmoshes iskatzoy lekuli yom. If something is called Muktzah, is not muchan in the onset of Shabbos, even if later, theoretically, it should be allowed, it's no longer allowed to be moved. Once it was Muktzah in the beginning, it goes for the whole day. Everyone holds that by Shabbos. Rabbi Yechanan applies it here to the mitzvahs. But on the 8th day, no one takes the lulav on the 8th day, mutter. And appreciate, Chavra, that even though we keep mineg aviseinu biyodenu, we, on the 8th day, as we'll see, we sit in the Sukah, we don't take the lulav on the 8th day. We don't use, for whatever reason, we don't take the lulav on the 8th day as a suffix, as a mineg from the suffix. When there was a doubt in the calendar, when there was a real doubt, they would take the lulav on the 8th day, because the 8th day could have been the 7th day of Sukkot. Sukah, however, can you use the schach? According to some Rishonim, the question is also about the walls. Afilu b'shmini, so you can't even use it for mundane purposes on the 8th day. Now, what type of mundane purposes would you be allowed to use it for? Firewood? We cannot create a fire on Yom Tov midrabanan, but once there is already a pre-lit flame, we can add to it. If you're winter, if it's cold in New York, Nabach and Sukkot, if there would not be an issue of, these items were designated for a mitzvah, then you would be allowed to use it. But the Sukkah may not be used on the 8th day. And the Gemara will give the reason why. Be consistent. Reish Lakish says, I disagree with you, Rabbi Yechanan. An esrog is allowed to be used even on the 7th day. B'shvinami mutter. But you know when? After you fulfill the mitzvah. And now the Gemara explains what is the underlying argument by Michael Mifligi. Mar Savar, that is Reish Lakish. Yes, when you designate something for a mitzvah, you may not use it then for anything else other than for the mitzvah. But it was designated not for the day, for the mitzvah. Le mitzvah is katzoy. So once the mitzvah was fulfilled, you can use it. Umar Savar, that's Rabbi Yechanan. No, it was designated for the day. Lukula yoyma is katzoy. Now, Chevra, just perhaps to suggest that's against zmanu makim. In other words, of course, it was designated for the mitzvah, for the item. But the item, the mitzvah of that item is in that day. And the more you link zmanu makim, maybe that's the shot, then the more it becomes designated for that entirety of the day. Eisvei. From our Mishnah, version number 1, our Mishnah wrote at the end of Daf Mem Hey, that the adults would grab the lulavim from the hands of the children, and they would also eat the esrogim. Now, did they only grab it from the minors? So and they ate it on the 7th day after they did the mitzvah. They ate it. Now, mele by minors, you can argue. Since the whole dalad minim of a katan is only mitzad chinuch, so we don't say this since it was designated. But if you can even take it from an adult and eat it on the 7th day, that's against Rabbi Yechanan. So Rabbi Yechanan will tell you, no, tenoike is dafke. It's not designated for a full-fledged mitzvah. Again, it's only chinuch. Other people say that adarabah, that it was Rabbi Yechanan that quoted our Mishnah to refute Reish Lakish. It says in our Mishnah, the Mishnah says tinoikis. Why did it say that we snatched that at the hands of the children? Well, does that not mean tinoikis in gedolim loy? Now, it's not that we didn't, guys, everyone grabbed everyone else's lulav. The question is, from when were they allowed to eat it? And the Mishnah being medayik, children, is to emphasize that only the children's asregim were allowed to be eaten. Is the charaya that it's katsoi, not only to the mitzvah, but also for the day? Answers the Gemara, that was just the way it was. The prevalent custom was that it was snatched out of the hands of the children. And Amar of Papa to Abaya, according to Rabbi Yechanan, Maishna Sukah, Maishna Esrog. In other words, if you subscribe to the concept that once it was designated for the day, well, if it's designated for the day and you are allowing the esrog to be consumed on Shmini Atzeres, which he is, so what about Sukkah? Why is Sukkah forbidden? Sukkah is also only connected to Chag HaSukkos. So answers the Gemara. Now this is Abaya explaining Rabbi Yechanan, Sukkah, the Chazya Lebein Hashmoshes. When it comes to twilight from 7th to 8th, you will sit in the Sukkah. Why will you sit in the Sukkah? Because twilight might be day. You have to sit in the Sukkah for 7 days. So as the 8th day enters, you are using the Sukkah for the mitzvah. We're speaking about if you were to eat something. If you would want to eat punk by twilight, you will be obligated to sit. Twilight might be the 8th. So what? Twilight might be the day. Might be the 7th. So Rabbi Yechanan, who subscribes to the concept of migud iskatsoy lebein hashmoshes iskatsoy lekula yoyma, so it goes into the 8th. Iskatsoy lebein hashmoshes, so migud lebein hashmoshes iskatsoy lebein shmini. But by esrog, dolay chazi lebein hashmoshes, why don't you take it in bein hashmoshes? Rabbi Yechanan is speaking de facto because the mitzvah is done in the morning. No one is going to wait until then. So lo iskatsoy lebein hashmoshes. No one is taking it that late. And therefore, it's never going to be a skatsoy for the 8th day. Okay. Now, Levi has a third opinion. So we had Rabbi Yechanan, we had Reish Lakish, now we have Levi. Levi says, Esroig afili b'shmini aser gevaldik. Even on the 8th day, it's going to be aser. Why is that? Says Rashi, even though you will not do the mitzvah twilight, because you did it in the morning, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Let's go with Rabbi Yechanan. Rabbi Yechanan says that once something is designated for a mitzvah for that day, you can't use it for anything else during that day. When does the 7th day end? You can't say that the 7th day ends prior to twilight, because there are some people who hold that twilight is still day. So the iskatsoi l'kula yoyma extends into twilight. Now you have to go to the next step. Once you already consider twilight a time in which the lulav is designated for a mitzvah, that automatically affects the 8th day. Beautiful. Now, what do we do? Says the Gemara, the father of Shmuel, the father of Shmuel's name was Abba Bar Abba. There's a whole story about that. Okay, but anyways, the father of Shmuel says, Esrog Bashvi'i is Asur, Esrog Bashvi'i Asur, but Bashmini Mutter, mamash like Rabbi Yechanan. However, after he ruled like Rabbi Yechanan, later he was machmir more, come avoid the Shmuel, in the sheet of Levi that it's also author on the 8th. Another statement, come Rab Zera b'shitasi the Abba de Shmuel, but Rab Zera then stood up and he says, I'm going to accept the original ruling of the father of Shmuel. I'm going to rule like Rabbi Yechanan, that the esrog is allowed to be consumed on the 8th. The Amar Rab Zera, esrog shenifsala, asr lo'oichla, kol shiva, implying only 7. Now, by the way, he's adding another nuance that we didn't have until now. Until now, we looked at every day as its own day. As its own day. Rab Zera holds that even if the esrog was only designated for the first day, we view the whole 7 days like one unit. So it becomes iskatsoy for all 7 days, but it does not go into the 8th. Weiter says the Gemara, a person should not transfer ownership. Hoishana means the bundle. The dalad minim to a child on the first day of Yom Tov, don't transfer ownership. Even though we learned above that giving it as a gift, al menas lahachser, is good, not to a child. Why? My tama, because the Yanuka, a young child, mikna kane, he is able to acquire rabbinically, mipnei darkei shalom, However, aknoy makna, but he doesn't have the power to transfer ownership. So when you'll gift it to him, he'll acquire it, but he won't be able to gift it back. And therefore, you won't own it if you didn't do the mitzvah yet. The ishtakach, it's going to come out. And as we learned above, that on the first day of Sukkah, even a borrowed lulav is not good. Now, what age is the age where we say that a child rabbinically is able to acquire but never able to transfer? That's a big machlokes between Rashi and Rambam. Rashi holds that only goes to when a child doesn't understand anything about business, and practically it varies between 6 or 10 years old. According to Rashi, a child older than that is able to transfer ownership. According to Rashi, you are able to give your dalad minim to a young child, let's say he was 11, 10, 11, 12, even be prior to your keeping your mitzvah. The Rambam argues, the Rambam holds that before bar mitzvah, a child never has the halachic power of transferring ownership. A child, yes, rabbinically is able to acquire to make sure that people don't steal things off children. And therefore, according to the Rambam, and so we paskin, never give it to a child prior bar mitzvah before you did your own mitzvah. Weiter. For Amar Rab Zena, loy lema inishli inuka, never tell a child that the Yehivni Lachmida, I'll give you something, and then don't give it to him. Be careful how you treat children. They'll remember. If many people make these commitments and then they don't follow through. I only said it to a child. You're teaching the child to be dishonest. And Shenemer, as it says in Yirmiyahu, that limdu l'shoinam, that we taught their tongues, diber, to speak falsehood. It's done by people not intentionally, people making commitments that they cannot follow through with their children. Now the Gemara says, Vaiter, I want you to know that just like we have this argument between Rabbi Yechanan and Reish Lakish, many other Amoraim had the same argument. Ubepluta that Rabbi Yechanan and Reish Lakish are the argument of others. The Itma. Hifrish Shiva Sregim L'Shiva Yamim, if you designated 7 Sregim for 7 days, 1 for each day, right? Now, guys, we just learned Levi. According to Levi, that would not help you, because even if it's only designated for 1 day, it affects all of the 7 days, but we're not mentioning Levi now. We're only mentioning Rabbi Yechanan and Reish Lakish. So Omar Rav kol achas va'achas yoitzebal va'oichlal alta, that after you used it for the mitzvah, Rav is like Reish Lakish. It's only designated for the mitzvah, not for the day. You can eat it on that day. But Rabasi, like Rabbi Yechanan, says kol achas va'achas yoitzebal, and you can only eat it tomorrow, meaning tonight. Why? Because we say migud iskatsoy liyoyma. Not only for the mitzvah. Here also, Marsava Rav holds limits. Fasa iskatsoy like Reish Lakish. So after the mitzvah, you can use it. Marsava, that's Rav Asi. Lekula yoyma iskatsoy, and we already said that we paskin like Rabbi Yechanan. Now let's begin. What about us in Bavel? So it's not so simple. In other words, the 8th day is ashtikal the 7th day. The Islam of Dinan. What should we do? Because minig obviously is to keep on doing what we did when we had a doubt. When we had a doubt, the 8th day could have been the 7th day. Amar Abaye Shmini. Since nowadays in Bavel it might be the 7th day, so it continues to be Yasa. It's now that we established that we paskin like Rabbi Yechanan, so outside Eretz Yisrael, the Dalad Minim remain Muktzah. Don't use it for your personal, don't use it for mundane on the 8th day. But the 9th day, what we call Simchas Torah, is only Safek Shemini, and therefore it is mutter. However, Mereimer Amar, Afilu Shmini, which is Safek Shvi, is mutter. You know why that is so? I'll tell you why that is so. Because all of this has to do with it being designated for a mitzvah. Since we don't take the lulav on the 8th day, we sit in the sukkah. We sit in the sukkah, as we'll see from our Gemara. We don't make a bracha, but we sit in. But lulav we don't take on the 8th day. So even according to Rabbi Yechanan, even outside Eretz Yisrael, it only remains muktzad, designated for mitzvah use on the 7th and not on the 8th. The surah Avdi Kimeremar, that they would eat their esrog on the 8th day. Rav Shisha b'Reid Ravida, Avid Ka'abaya, and the Gemara says that the halacha here is like Abaye. It's not part of the Yal Kegam. First of all, we don't paskin this way, but more importantly, I'm sorry, we don't eat it. We paskin like Abaye. Abaye and Rava halacha kirava, chutz mi Yal Kegam. But this halacha Abaye. Okay. Amar Rabbi Yehuda Berei de Rabbi Shmuel Bar Shilas, in the name of Rav. Shmini, which outside Israel is maybe Shavi'i. It was a suffix. Now, minig avosenu b'yodeinu. So how do we treat that day? So we're not focusing anymore on the lulav. Now we're going to go to sukkahs. Shvi l'sukkah, you have to sit in the sukkah. You have to. Why? Because maybe it's the 7th day, even though it's the 8th. We're calling it 8th. But when it comes to a bracha, ushmini lebracha. Ushmini lebracha says Rashi 2 lines before the bottom of the Amid that when you daven and when you bench and when you make kiddush, you don't say Chag HaSukkos, but you say, look inside Rashi's Nusach, you say Yoim Hashmini Chag Atzeres Hazeh, and we know that this is not our Nusach. Our Nusach is Shmini Atzeres HaChag Hazeh. At another time, we'll speak about the difference. Back inside the Gemara. The Rabbi Yechanan Amar, the last line in the Amid, Shmini Lozeh. Wow. It's considered the 8th day. Now, when he says it's considered the 8th day, even concerning Sukkah, Rabbi Yechanan doesn't mean to say that you don't sit on the Sukkah. No, the Gemara right away clarifies. Meisav, in respect to sitting in the Sukkah outside of Eretz Yisrael on the 8th day, Kula Alma Loi Pligi, everyone agrees that you have to sit in the Sukkah as we do. What is the machloikes between Rabbi Yechanan and Rav? Ki Pligi, the top of Daf Mem Zayin, is only regarding making the bracha, meaning the bracha leishav basukah. And here we go on. Laman the Omar Shvi'i L'Sukkah, which was what we said in the name of Rav, Rabbi Yehuda in the name of Rav. Not only do you have to dwell in the Sukkah, but Baruch Hinami Mevorchinan, you have to make the bracha. Wow, to dwell in the Sukkah. Even according to Rav, when you make Kiddush, when you make Birchas Hamazon, when you're davening, you are coining that day Shmini Atzeres HaChag Hazeh. But on the other hand, if you have to sit in the sukkah, now there's no sukkah on Shmini Atzeres, so you make the bracha leishev basukah. But lemanda amar Shmini lozel, what Rabbi Yechanan meant to add was not that don't sit outside Eretz Yisrael. You had to. There was a doubt, and even though now there's no doubt, minig avosenu b'yodeinu. All Rabbi Yechanan is saying is you're stuck. You have to be consistent. You can't make a bracha leishev basukah because it's not the holiday of Sukkot. No, since by Tefilla and by Birchas Hamazon and by Kiddush, you're coining that day as Shmini Atzeres HaChag Hazeh, so don't make the leishev basukah. And indeed, that's the way we paskin. We sit in the sukkah on the 8th day, we dwell in the sukkah on the 8th day, but a bracha leishev basukah is made the last time at the Su'udah that we say goodbye to the sukkah to at the end of Shana Rabbah. Chevra, God willing, a lot more to be continued. Wow, that was great. Have a good day, guys.